Now it's my pleasure to introduce our poet tonight, who has an impressive list of works and things in her background. She was the keynoter this year at the Oregon Poetry Association Spring Conference at Clackamas Community College. Her books and poems have won the Oregon Book Award for singing the Mozart Requiem, the Editions Prize for Surgeonfish, and the Yellow Glen Award for the Angels of Sharpest Ascending. Her first book, Moving the House, was chosen for a BOA editions by William Stafford, who wrote the introduction. Evensong, a finalist for the T.S. Eliot Award, is now in its second printing, as is her chapbook, Blow the Candle Out. So her books are available back here on the table, just next to the treats tonight. Founder of the Lane Literary Guild, she is co-editor of From Here We Speak, an anthology of American poetry, and in her own image, Women Working in the Arts. Her teaching guide, Starting with Little Things, a guide to writing poetry in the classroom, is in its sixth printing. A pianist and scuba diver. She has taught in the MFA program at Antioch University, Los Angeles, as a 3-time senior Fulbright professor in Frankfurt, Maine, and Freiburg, Germany, and as a visiting poet in hundreds of classrooms, grades K through 12, and in universities throughout the U.S. You might see her poem, Letter from a Fan, in the 4th grade in Evensong. John Daniel says about Evensong that it sounds the depths of everyday experience and sings the mystery she finds stirring there, bearing witness to the things that matter most: love, spirit, memory, mortality, and the wonder of being alive. They are ambitious in the highest sense. She lives with her husband, poet and writer Ralph Salisbury, in Eugene. So for more information, you can visit her website, which is www.ingridwendt.com. Would you join me in welcoming a kickoff poet for our 6th season of the Milwaukie Poetry Series, Ingrid Wendt. Ingrid.
Thank you.
Water for two.
Okay, great. Thanks. I just read the instructions. Not on the mantelpiece.
Yeah, we couldn't put it down there.
Okay. Thank you all for coming. It's just a really tremendous pleasure to see friends here and some new faces. And it's a great honor to be part of this series. I've been hearing about this series for years. So it's wonderful to be here. I'm going to start off with the poem you have in your hands, which was written for my husband, Ralph Salisbury, who is sitting in the front row. This was written in 1996, actually, after, well, the poem says, "Give us this day. Just as everyone knows, the end might come without warning. Any morning, the usual intersection, and someone running the light. Or maybe a gun in the cafeteria, suitcase exploding, fuselage simply missing one simple bolt. And we know not to dwell on these thoughts to survive. Just as when my older friend was dying and knew it, saying, I've learned what I wish I'd known all my life. And I wanted to know her secret and didn't ask, so sure of having one last chance. This much I've learned. Savor it, this daily bread. What if this were our last day alive? So, too, you with your own secret ticking, lab tests predicting tomorrow the beats all of us count on could stop. With proper exercise, diet, maybe not for a year or two or more. Each moment, remember. Each moment, forget. Systole, diastole, push, pull. Dear one, whose heart knows and won't tell. And before I forget, I want to announce that Ralph has 2 new books coming out this year, a book of poems in October from the Habit of Rainy Nights Press, and a memoir which won the Riverteeth National Book Award for Literary Nonfiction, titled So Far, So Good. And that's coming out in the spring. I'm going to start off with 3 new poems that I've never read before, and I'm going to go back into others. Some that you may have heard, some of you. I hope most of them will be new to you, however. Triage. The night the waters rose in the hurricane's wake, half a continent away. The smallest spider, eyelash thin, albino white, somehow found its way into my dry kitchen sink. And as I woke to news of the highest ever watermark already crested, and as makeshift shelters and stadiums filled, that smallest of spiders struggled against the sides of my dry kitchen sink, which would not stay dry much longer. And as those whose denial and oversight had been the cause deftly vanished into the maze of their own empty expressions, as those in charge of rescue competed in passing the blame, and we in the comfort of our rhetoric watched from safety the rise of sewage mingling with seawater, fresh water, with what used to be roofs and magnolias and faith, I gently lowered a tissue onto the floor of my empty sink. That smallest of spiders climbed onto it, trusting. And gently I carried tissue and spider out the kitchen door, into the crimson impatience, and left them there. As some of you may gather, this was Hurricane Katrina I was writing about. I tend to do this. I take notes for something, I come back to them years later. And then I continue with it. And I put it away again, and I come back to it. So this one's, I think, finished. The Knowing. Just around the corner, down the hill, my father walked away, unhurt. 2 months pregnant, my mother, waiting for him to come home from work, heard it and ran. They'd argued fiercely the night before, my mother saying, "I want this baby." My father saying, "You tricked me once, how do I know?" What did I know? I was nearly 7. Cherries were bearing outside my bedroom window, where they'd had the fight. In the closet, I'd covered my ears. The car was totaled. The train my father had hit or been hit by, no one ever knew, went on its way. And I, ready to help, climbed my favorite tree, picked the ripest cherries to take to neighbors to sell for 25 cents a pint, gave 3/4 to my mother for the new car I knew for sure we'd need. Second child. This comes from notes, really, really old notes. I collect things. You should see our garage. There was never a right time, we said. Oh, second child. There was never a right time, we said. The limits of patience, bones. This cradle of energy, large enough only for poems. Already 1 daughter, a wholesome family life as it could be, undone. The house to finish building, the trip of a lifetime everyone saves for. Suspecting the dream can't happen even when it does. What we knowingly would not betray, would always remember her scalp, a tingle of fine black hair, whorled fingerprint, wet and fragrant. The pillow even without her, the sleep of exhaustion, eyes without thinking, blinking, believing in nothing but love, love, a word so total it never existed before. The rash of tears, the milk controlling all of our lives, the blood startling still each month, although it was planned. I really want to thank Tom and all the volunteers here in Milwaukie who have made this evening possible, who make this series possible. And I want to thank you again. I've said it, but I want to say it again. Thank you so much. You mentioned my awards, Tom, and that reminded me of something I came across recently. A statement by Stanley Kunitz made at one of his readings just shortly before he died. Stanley Kunitz, a well-known American poet who died at the age of 100, kept writing, working until the end. And something he said about prizes really resonates with me. You look back on a lifetime and think of what has been given to the world by your presence, your fugitive presence. Inevitably, you have to think of your art, whatever it may be, as the gift you have made to the world, in acknowledgement of the gift you have been given, which is the life itself. And I think the world tends to forget that this is the ultimate significance of the body of work each artist produces. It is not an expression of the desire for praise or recognition or prizes, but the deepest manifestation of your gratitude for the gift of life. And I really like that. Another quotation by someone that I had the privilege of meeting when I was very, very young. I think I was 22, maybe. It was W.H. Auden in Eugene, where we live. I was seeing a fellow who worked at our local rag, the Register Guard, and he had the business beat in the paper. But when Auden came to town, his assignment was to interview Auden. Well, he didn't know much about poetry, and so he asked me along to do the questioning. Business beat, well, he had good sense. And I was pretty awed by the whole experience. And also I was very conscious of the readers of this local newspaper. What would they want to hear him talk about? So I asked Mr. Auden, why do you write? And his answer was immediate: to help people enjoy life more or to endure it better. That stayed with me. I read this poem about second child and about my being a child. I'm aware that my having been a child, that this evening I have a chance to do something I've really never done quite before, which is to read a little bit from each of my books as though it was perhaps a retrospective. I've always loved going to visual artists' retrospective, and I love having visual art around us on these walls as I read. I'm going to digress a little bit because as Tom was talking about your paintings, Penelope, I was reminded of something similar but about a different art form. I think it was Aldous Huxley said, after silence, that which comes closest to expressing the inexpressible is music. And visual art does the same. And I love it when there are intersections between music and art and poetry. And music is another thread that winds through my work. This is titled Evensong. I promised a poem about motherhood. Another thread that winds through all 5 books is the fragility of everything. So I'm going to begin with a poem, the first one in this book, titled Poem at 45. Summer, July, hot. And the daredevil spiders, like an eruption of mushrooms, nightly string the whole of their faith between the same doomed places. Volkswagen to Datsun, picnic table to movable bench, bushes each side of the front porch step. Look, these spiders are everywhere, shiny gold peas. They'd spin the whole house up if they could. We'd sleep the ritual 100 years. We'd have to hack our way out. And yet each morning I find them beautiful. Go out of my way to lift lightly at least one nearly invisible polar thread to another, safer anchor, each shimmering flat before Columbus' plate of the world, adrift, wheels within wheels, and the motionless sun at the center, a solstice poised in its own readiness. Silent, as some days my own words dissolve in my hands, middle-aged and amazed at where they have come from, where they are going. My daughter, 18, on her own, but connected. My mother, 78, on her own, still connected. And I, in the knowledge, there is no morning I cannot wake up and find the world forever changed. And like a number of poems I'm going to read, this is an older one. This one is titled Poem at 45. Clearly, I'm not 45. Although I am really, you just can't see it. This daughter, about whom I no longer write, I told her that last time I saw her. I said, really, I haven't written about you in about 20 years. She's just turned 40, or she's almost 41. This daughter has been the subject through many of my poems, and I'm going to read one of the very first written for her about being a mother. That's another thread that's been a major thread. Having given birth, and this is from the first book, Moving the House, published in 1980. And if you are interested, you can find it online. You just Google Moving the House, Ingrid Wendt, and the whole book is there. There's a project in Connecticut called by the Connecticut College Faculty of English, and Connecticut College has a whole bunch of books that are out of print. Those of you who are poets in the audience and you have books out of print, I'm not sure they're still doing this, but they were doing it for a while. So I'll put you in touch if you're interested. Having given birth, for the first time, my body comes back to itself. Spine, half a wishbone, doubles back, victorious. Stretch marks on my breasts fade pale as milk. Around my head, songs from my childhood quiver like moths. They ask to be taken back. They ask forgiveness for having been gone so long. Through my own lips, my mother's voice sings my daughter to sleep. When she sleeps at my breast, I become the oldest person I have ever known. I am younger than I can remember. Strange and mysterious how the past comes back through us, and things we thought we'd forgotten in certain contexts we remember. And then there's the darker side, because I think sometimes as much as there's beauty in most experiences in life, if we can look at them that way, or in certain experiences anyway, there's never beauty without its dark side somehow. And the next poem it's another older one, remembering Bruegel's Massacre of the Innocents. It gives you a clue that it's going to be dark. It wasn't until I was in my 30s that Ralph and I went to Europe. It was my first time going to Europe. It was a great privilege and very, very exciting. We ended up in Vienna, Austria, and our daughter was 4. Ralph had a sabbatical from the University of Oregon, and we had the great good fortune of living in various places for a month each. We were in Vienna for a week, in Munich area for a month, Spain for a month. It was fabulous. But our 4-year-old needed other kids. She needed information. We hadn't quite anticipated some things. We took her to this absolutely stunning art museum, the first art museum I'd ever seen, and the poem describes that. And then it became more difficult as the day progressed. Remembering Bruegel's Massacre of the Innocents, another little postscript, or a foreword, I mentioned sausages in the first stanza. It was so nice. We'd go into butcher shops to get our regular salami and bread and cheese for lunch, and these shop owners would give her like a hot dog or something, or a piece of salami. Having a 4-year-old with you opens many doors. I'd known it hung there in Vienna, but home was the place for warnings of strangeness, of not taking rides or candy. With me now, even wieners from butcher shop owners were safe. Together now we were climbing palatial marble steps, the guidebook having said nothing of archways twice as high as our house, completely studded with color, real gold-covered crossbeams, a ceiling of painted-on seasons of glory, each hair on each head, as my father would say, so precise you could see it, assuming you could get close, as the artists had, hanging there day after day for months, their dangers of falling so far removed from our journey, past sculptures, on landings, to canvas in far-off rooms. I would have stared upward longer, but you were obsessed with the head of Medusa in what's-his-name's hand. My memory not so needed as saying, it's really all make-believe. No one could ever have snakes for hair. No one cut off her head, although maybe he would have, had she been real. What's true is, I didn't avoid when I could have. That room with 15 original Bruegels, the first I had ever seen, not in a book. The Tower of Babel, Peasant Dance. The other I couldn't draw you away from, could only respond, those soldiers lived too far back to remember. They must have been following orders. Their leaders must have been mean. More I could have said, and still not enough. So much you already knew of betrayals, and still you returned again and again from rooms of Rembrandt and Rubens, Cranach's Adam and Eve, and hundreds of Christs on the cross. You returned to take in details no one could forget. The mothers pleading, the children lying in blood, in snow, in a huge commotion of lances, hooves, dogs, the wails of the children, the mothers helpless with blood on their laps, on their hands, their eyes turned back from heaven. Aaron, no one forgives such things. Nor do I know why we stayed until closing, hurrying out with our postcards and parcels into the late May drizzle. Why I sat on a park bench while you tried finding pleasure in dancing like pigeons, hiding from me again and again behind the base of Maria Theresa's statue, knowing I knew where you were, insisting I couldn't find you anywhere. Having been born and raised in Aurora, Illinois, 40 miles west of Chicago, the Oregon landscape is still a wonder to me. And yeah, we're all here. We're so lucky. But still, I go back now sometimes, and it's okay. I swore I'd never want to live there again, and I probably don't. But this landscape still compels me. One of the things, I'll go back to this book, one of the things that was an absolute sign that Ralph and I had to get married, besides falling in love, was that his first poem, when he came to Oregon 6 years before I did, his first poem was about Devil's Elbow on the Oregon coast, just north of Florence and south of Yachats. And my first poem in Oregon was about the Oregon coast, Devil's Elbow. So I will read that just for the heck of it. I also have some Columbus poems. Okay, Oregon coast, Devil's Elbow, and my marker fell out, but here we go. You'll hear in here that I came from the Midwest, drove in a car through many states, saw the Teton Mountains, which I thought were wonderful, and then went to Devil's Elbow and got caught in the tide because I had totally forgotten about that. I mean, I sort of knew when I was growing up there were such things, but I had never experienced it. And if you ever do go to Devil's Elbow State Park, and there are these wonderful little caves, you go out around this point, and then there's a little cave. You can sit there and read all afternoon, like I did. But you watch where the tide is, and you take note that it's coming back. Oregon coast, Devil's Elbow. As only in books things happen, I stand in the cove, where the only way out is back over the rock, tired from crossing in arabesques as though it must be done in style. Grossly reaped fields, stale buffalo land, Tetons ribboned in ice. Blinded green by sun on high moss, the waves rip starfish, islands of kelp, race to catch cliff-spilled tiaras. My breath is calm as the gull rocked above me on moss-held cliffs. There is no going back, no need to go on. I was strangely calm, even though I had to wade out waist deep and my jeans got all torn up by barnacles. But if I'm going to die, it's okay if it's here. But a friend read that and thought it was something suicidal. No, I don't think so. Feeling dry. Ralph and I, when we were younger, used to love to camp. And he taught me to fish with worms and figuring out where different things were. And then when we determined there were no fish, we would sometimes, if the river was calm, drift. We'd wear our wetsuits sometimes, scuba diver wetsuits, and take our snorkels and face masks and snorkels and then just drift. And then we'd tie our tennies around our waist and hike back and then drift again. And one day we were just sure there were no fish. Feeling dry. To want to write, but to lack words. More accurately, to lack something to feel. This unpainted desk, cars outside proving themselves on the hill. Smoke from burning fields, slipping unnoticed under the sun until someone drowns in his own breath. To listen for some wind. To feel responsible for listening and to be unmoved. An air sock limp as an unfilled dunce's cap. Waiting some change in the weather. Something full as the river you fished last weekend without luck. And then swimming, saw the whitefish grazing on stones. The flickering trout, steady as mobiles suspended on more levels than you thought water could contain. Surgeonfish is my fourth book of poems, and Surgeonfish is a real fish that will attack if threatened. It's a tropical fish. It's not the kind you'll find in the Mackenzie River. And being a scuba diver, as well as an avid snorkeler, I've seen surgeonfish in numerous locations in warm water, not off the Oregon coast either. They will attack, and the way they defend themselves is to come at you straight on and then to glance off of you, because their back fins are razor sharp, and this is how they got the name surgeonfish. And we actually were attacked by some. This poem I'm going to read is about that, because in many of my poems I realize in retrospect the natural world somehow intersects with the political one or the social one. I have a hard time just writing about just that place without being aware of the context in which I find myself there, if that makes any sense. This poem has 3 different threads going through it. One is the place itself and snorkeling around the tip of the Sinai Peninsula. We were in the Sinai Peninsula for a week in 1995. And we started out in the Gulf of Aqaba, ended up in the Gulf of Suez. We had a guide with us. We stayed in this place called Sharm el-Sheikh. And I was teaching in Germany. Ralph was teaching in Germany that year too. And this was one of these last-minute vacations. Go snorkeling and diving in the Red Sea. It sounds very exotic, and it was very exotic. But nevertheless, there's all this beauty and then all this darkness around us. And you'll hear that. The beauty of the place, the beauty of the fish was compelling. What else was compelling was my awareness of what I was told was happening in that place. At that time, I think it still is Egypt, but there was a war fought there in that very place where we were snorkeling, the 6-day war. And so this snorkeling trip was not without its complexity. So you'll hear about that. You'll also hear about the history of the Sinai Peninsula. And you'll hear, and here's the thing that holds it all together, that shortly after we returned, the son of a friend of mine had written a 4th grade novel called Surgeonfish. And in it, the surgeonfish was saving the reef from the shark. And, okay, you'll hear the rest. One more thing, because on the page you can follow this, but if you'll forgive my indulging just talking about it. One more thing is that right after I had seen Glenn and told him about our experience, Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated just about a week later, and this poem came out of that. Surgeonfish. What I don't tell Glenn when I respond to his prize-winning 4th grade novel about the spined avenger could fill another book, and has done, and keeps on being rewritten. Although it really can be scary, I tell him, I know from experience, yes, that fish really will attack. You've chosen your brave protagonist well. But Ralph and I were swimming too close, I tell him, to spawning grounds. Eggs, or newly hatched young, or maybe that leveled off part of the reef was their own. Last night on TV, the foreign minister saying, for some, it's always been land that must be defended. For others, it's life. And the surgeonfish, 2 of them, named for the bright orange, scalpel-sharp fins at the base of the tail, striking from out of the blue, head on, then swerving, flack, glancing the whole length of our bodies, again and again. We must have looked funny, flailing, thrashing the surface, like runners dodging a sniper, like puppets unstrung. But they were beautiful. That's what we'd come for. Such color The neon indigo stripes of the black-scaled surgeonfish, neon indigo edging the top and bottom, black fins edging the tail, that pectoral fin close to the gills, such a bright daffodil sun. And this just one of so many others named in my book and on Glenn's video game. They're real. And here we swam. I draw for him his carpet, our sand, the Gulf of Aqaba, Gulf of Suez, around the tip of the Sinai, behind us that many-storied mountain, the sacred remains of St. Catherine, somewhere the spot where Moses received God's law. We swam. Behind us, Magic Lake, not far inland, the whitest sand, the water a turquoise like nothing we've ever seen. We posed for photos. Glenn, your resolution, I tell him, is wonderfully balanced, mature, the way the spined avenger saves the reef from Scarface, the shark. Without fighting, they sign an agreement. What is the whole, or even half, of the story? Our guide, Mr. Jamal, in the 6-Day War, fought at Magic Lake. Where we stood, he saw men fall. I don't say to Glenn, Israel, Egypt, Anwar Sadat, Rabin. Mr. Jamal, our guide, didn't use wetsuit or fins. The currents were strong. Only an arm away to our left, the reef dropped off into darkness, down, down, 2,000 feet down. And all we could see was beauty. That poem has been reprinted in an anthology, and I neglected to bring it with me. It's a newly published anthology titled Before There Is Nowhere to Stand, Israel-Palestine, Poets Respond to the Struggle. Very, very powerful anthology. And I am neither Jewish nor Palestinian, so I'm sort of an outsider looking in, and that was my role. Change of pace. Singing the Mozart Requiem was the first book in which I'm deliberately, consciously writing about music in one form or another. I am privileged to sing with a choir in Eugene. At the time that I was writing this book, I sang with the Eugene Concert Choir, and we sang the Mozart Requiem twice, several years in between. We sang the Bach V minor Mass. We've done lots of really big, wonderful, glorious things. I was raised to be a concert pianist and couldn't keep words out of my head, so a lot of poems have music in them anyway. I'm going to read just a little part of the title poem, Singing the Mozart Requiem. It's nothing to do with the Requiem. When my conductor or director saw it, he says, I don't see where Mozart's in here at all. But music does that. Sometimes it brings thoughts to mind. And again, I offer a contrast between beauty and the other side, the dark side. Those of you who participate in music, even those of you who don't participate, you probably share this experience with me of having something run through your mind and run through your mind. And the Mozart Requiems, the pieces, while I was doing other things, stayed with me. And this is just the first of 5 parts. Some of us already older than Mozart was, when death tipped the job to his student. It isn't your usual courage, quam olim abrehe promisisti, that every week brings us here. Abraham isn't first on our minds. Promises fail. The rest eternal, these words plead for, hopefully many years off, knowing this, et lux perpetua, is the 20th century. This, et lux perpetua, this breath we utter together is not going to bring back the selves we know ourselves have buried inside. The promise is all of us once made never to grow old, to add layers of caution like rings on a tree, saying this rehearsal is recreation, a justification to families, friends, time taken from keeping up with the news, the job, what we say, we owe ourselves. This exhilaration again, unexpected, we are at this moment alive. Through each of these books, there are parenting poems also. Our daughter, 13, says she is spending the night with a friend. Coming home from the movies, we say, this was the right choice. She wouldn't have liked this anyway. No danger, no sex. So wholesome, even the dogs behaved, their tongues at the end of the 50-mile race discreet, out of sight. And we enter the silent house, more silent, knowing this silence will last all night long. No sudden explosions of music through air vents. Nerves we didn't know we had developed like shields. Invisible guardians, love demands of the self so that it can keep on giving. Tangible now is moments of change no one notices. One last bedtime story we didn't remark upon. When did we last pick her up? This daughter who won't read the paper we left this morning, pointedly open. The 9-year-old girl in the next town 2 days missing, found dead. Daughter we don't yet know, next weekend with friends will call from a phone booth at midnight, not say where she is, although later the ending will turn out all right. Beginning each night, this watching with nothing to see. It's kind of scary when your kid gets in their teens, you know. I'm deviating from my planned course of action here, just to kind of respond, let these poems bounce off each other. Another mother-daughter poem in the last book. On the nature of touch. This is a long one too. I realize getting this reading together, I've got a lot of long poems, and thank you for listening through them. On the nature of touch. My daughter's cat in the morning, before he'll eat, needs to be picked up and petted, cradled as I used to carry my daughter on one hip from pantry to counter and back to the dish of food that was fresh the first time he sniffed it, but not good enough. This cat can be roaming all night, returning ravenous. This cat can be let outside at first light and stand moon patient at the door until we rise again. His fur can be 6 soggy layers of needles and moss on the floor of the Oregon Coast Range, and still the salmon supreme we spoon into his dish holds that scrupulous tongue only an instant before his voice stalks our slippers. Our wonder again at such hunger for touch that goes beyond all bodily need. So we stroke him between the ears, stirring up the same food. And we rub his nose just over the spot where the whiskers sprout. Run our hands repeatedly down the long rapids of his spine until dander and fur rise like spume, drift in the imperceptible breath of the furnace, saying, "Good cat, good pillow, eat." And my daughter, who hardly could wait to be out on her own, phones from her student apartment once, maybe twice a day to ask for my stroganoff recipe, or if vinegar will, in the absence of cleanser, clean a greasy sink. She reads me the funnies. Will I give her a ride to the store? Each day this delicate sniffing the ground called home. The words we speak, a ritual independent of meaning, thin fingers sifting the rich humus of memory. Bright splashes of hair dye she left behind on the downstairs hall carpet, each color a different year of her life. Stones scattered by Gretel to find the way back. There is no returning to where she has been. How can I not cradle her each time she calls? One more blessed delay on the long, slow road from touching each of us took for granted. Those years I held her in my arms at least once a day, and she held me in a gaze that knew nothing but trust. Water disappearing through cracks in my fingers, I myself tried as a child over and over to cup and drink clear in my small, close hands. We're running close to the end, and I want to share maybe 2 or 3 more with you. A thread that can't stay out of my poems, as I've already mentioned, is the awareness of the world around us. And sometimes that means facing some really hard things that are around us. I want to read something by Pablo Picasso, who is, as you know, not a writer. Artists who live and work with spiritual values cannot and should not remain indifferent to a conflict in which the highest values of humanity and civilization are at stake. I've found as the years go by that writing about things that might be termed political happens more and more. I wondered at one time if that ever would happen. I'm looking for, here it is. When I was younger, I wondered if I would ever write about anything besides my personal life. And it turns out I do that more and more as time goes on. I want to show you this book, which I haven't talked about very much or read from very much. It's titled In Her Own Image, Women Working in the Arts. And it's an anthology that I co-edited. It was published, again, a long time ago, 1980. But at that time that I published this, I co-edited with Elaine Hedges. The time we did this in 1980, it was really a new thing to do a book with women writers, and it still is a new thing, I think, with women writers, visual artists, musicians, photographers, and put them together. And my co-editor and I tried doing this in such a way that we presented not only work by women writers and other artists, but we tried to present them in a thematic way. So the book is divided into 4 sections. I just realized that this is something I really want to talk about. The book is divided in 4 sections. The first is titled Women's Art and Household Work, because for centuries, we did not find women doing anything except what we call household arts: quilting, weaving, pottery, stitching. There's many, many different household arts. There's a wonderful poem by Marge Piercy in here called To Be of Use. And I would like to read that to you. To Be of Use, unless I'm misremembering the title of it. I'm sorry, it's called Licking at Quilts. So yeah, I told you. Whoever decided what is useful in its beauty means less than what has no function besides beauty, except its weight in money. Art without frames. It held parched corn. It covered the table where soup misted savor. It covered the bed where the body knit to self and other and the dark wool of dreams. The love of the ordinary blazes out, the backyard miracle, Ohio sunflower, snail's track, sweet gum leaf, moon over the mountain. These are titles of quilts. In the pattern tulip and peony, the sense of design matters, the essence of what sprawled in the afternoon, called conventionalized, to render out the intelligence, the graphic wit. Some have a wistful, faded, posy yearning, star of the four winds, star of the west, Queen Charlotte's crown. In a crabbed humor as far from pompous as a rolling pin, you can trace wrinkles from smiling under a scorching grasshopper's sun. Monkey wrench, the drunkard's path, fool's puzzle, puss in the corner, robbing Peter to pay Paul. I love all these titles. And the deflating hearts and gizzards. Pierced quilts, patchwork from best gowns, winter woolens, linens, blankets, worked jigsaw of the memories of braided lives, precious scraps. Women were buried, but their clothing wore on. Out of death from childbirth at 16, hard work at 40. Out of love for the trumpet vine and the melon, they issued to us Rocky Road to Kansas, Job's Troubles, Crazy Anne, the double Irish chain, the tree of life. This quilt might be the only perfect artifact a woman would ever see, yet she did not doubt what we had forgotten, that out of her potatoes and colic, sawdust and blood, she could create. Together, alone, she seized her time and made new. The second section, I'm not going to read from each section, is titled In Her Own Image. And we discovered that when women, and younger women, when younger women start to write or to create, it's to write about the self and identity. And then as time goes on, other subjects find us, and we found that throughout history. We have Muriel Rukeyser, whom I also had the pleasure of meeting once. We have a sequence of women artists like Kata Kolwitz being written about by Muriel Rukeyser. That's just a sample. Okay, I'm going to conclude with a couple more poems from Evensong. This is a short one, and it was written for William Stafford about a book that he gave me and I took to Germany with me when we were there teaching for a year. And I shipped it home and it got lost. Losing in the mail my years-old copy of your specially autographed book. As when my father died, and I wasn't as I had intended holding his hand, was taking care instead of my mother at home, cooking supper, doing the dishes, before returning to his hospital bed, that 1 hour only all day, and that was the hour, of course, he died, alone, although the nurses said they had been in the room right then, turning him over. How easy to catch that small, well-meaning deception. Last summer in Frankfurt, I didn't want to think about packing the box again. I wanted to trust the post office clerk, who said the box would be perfectly safe, tied up only in string. Let him slit the tape. It would be so much cheaper. True. And the office was closing. I was leaving tomorrow morning, my suitcase already too full. And nothing that precious could ever truly be lost if I willed it not so. The book showed up. About 3 months later, somehow, You know, a few remnants from that box found their way to my house. Not everything. Yeah, the big book I brought home from the Chartres Cathedral in France, somebody wanted that. Poetry. The last poem in this book is, again, about music, primarily, because I now sing with a group of 13 women. We sing a cappella. We perform twice a year. We rehearse every Wednesday night. I'm not there tonight. They excused me. The poem was written to go into an anthology that the Lane Literary Guild did in Eugene, Oregon. An anthology of poems written for, these poems are written for that anthology, or they were collected by poets for that anthology, titled Dona Nobis Pacem, Give Us Peace. The whole concert by the Eugene Concert Choir, of which I was no longer a member, they were doing this whole program on music that had to do with peace. And they asked the Guild to give them some poems to hand out with the programs. What a great idea. So the Guild put together this anthology of poems on peace, and everyone in the audience, the music audience, got poems with their programs, which I thought was a brilliant stroke. And so I wrote this one about the experience of singing. It's titled Sanctuary. As flocks of birds from the depths of the field rise in unison, arc and wheel and dip, with no one bird in the lead, and settle again into land. As fish in their silent schools flash silver together, pivot and pivot again on the same invisible axis. When the music begins, and we in our separate sections stop that inner, ever-present mental chatter and join together in song. Again, I forget that in the last election, the second soprano next to me almost certainly voted wrong. That in tomorrow's headlines, the next suicide bomber will take away more lives than any one heart can mourn. That in the next town a friend lies dying. That global warming tomorrow will give us yet one more extinction. Here, floodwaters rising will threaten no one. Tenderness rises and is not scorned or shunned. Anger on the horizon crashes and rolls, breaks without mercy over our heads, and no harm is done. What is sacred space, if not this shelter of song? What is prayer, if not these measures in which the heart can pour itself out, 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 and the notes will catch it, help bear it along. Moments in which each wounded and fragmented self abides again in the wonder of wholeness here, in this place, this home. Thank you very much.